All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you've all had a wonderful few days at this conference. For those of you who are still here to the bitter end, you are in for a rare treat. I have had the privilege of seeing our next speaker at a number of brownfields and other conferences and convenings, and I can tell you he is an incredibly dynamic speaker and may say some things that will challenge some of you, may say some things that may make some of you uncomfortable, but I would encourage you to be a sponge, because what he has to tell us is incredibly important in the work that we all do in brownfields, whether we're a consultant or an attorney or a community member or a regulator. It is something that touches truly all of us in our lives. When I asked Dr. Pastor how he would like to be introduced, what would the thing that he would like highlighted, and he said that he has been married to the same woman for 42 years. Sir, congratulations. As you can see on the screen, Dr. Manuel Pastor is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He is also the director of the Dornsife Equity Research Institute and directs the Equity Research Institute there at USC. I also would like to note that he holds a doctorate from UMass Amherst, which is also near and dear to my heart. So, Dr. Pastor, if you are ready, I'd like to welcome you to the California Land Recycling Conference and look forward to your presentation.
So, yes, 42 years of marriage. And what we've learned from that is that there's, like we often say, we've been married for 42 years, many of them happily. So sometimes there are good times, sometimes there are hard times, but you can learn from each one of those. And I know that it's tough to be the last speaker in a long conference. It's especially tough because you've had the excitement of both karaoke and a fire alarm. So I will try to jazz it up as we speak. And I always like to let folks know before I get started that if while I'm speaking, my voice tires out or cracks a little bit, it's not because I'm exhausted or because I feel so emotionally overwhelmed being with a bunch of people who work on brownfields. I mean, what a great group of people. It's actually that I have a voice condition called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box, which other people have, and can cause your voice to break or tire out. And this is true. It gets treated once a month with Botox, which is how we treat everything in Los Angeles. It's kind of totally works for us. So we've been through a difficult last couple of years. The last couple of years of COVID have been rough for those of us who have lost family members, who have lost friends. It is also true that COVID was the disease that revealed our illnesses as a society. It revealed the racial wealth gap, which meant that some people had no cushion with which they could respond. It revealed the digital divide, which meant that some, particularly Latinos and African Americans, their children were not able to learn as well during schools being shut down. It revealed the lack of access to healthcare. It revealed environmental injustices, such as air pollution, which meant that some people were far more susceptible to COVID. And all of that got reflected in the death rates. These are the age-adjusted death rates for LA County, and while the screen is not that sharp, the rates for Black Angelenos, about twice that of white Angelenos, for Latino Angelenos, about 3 times, for Pacific Islanders, interestingly, even higher. So this was the disease that revealed our illnesses. It is also a period of time which illustrated our mutuality. And that is the fact that some of us at least wore masks, not just to protect ourselves, but to protect those around us. Some of us went to soup kitchens, mutual aid societies came up. So we realized that our health was dependent on everyone else's health. But it's also the case that this crisis revealed our divisions, the fights that occurred around masking versus non-masking, and the political divisions that have gotten even sharper in our country. And those divisions, on the one hand, the mutuality, on the other hand, the divisions, became even sharper in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. The murder of George Floyd illustrated two things. One is, of course, it deeply illustrated the nature of racist policing. But for others, what got realized was that racist policing was just the tip of a racist iceberg. That is, that there were racial inequalities, not just in the way communities were policed, but in how our economy operated, in how our education systems operated, and even how our environmental systems operated in terms of who was on the wrong side of the environmental divide. So we are in a moment of change and reckoning, shock of COVID, the realizations that came about as a result of the murder of George Floyd. It's a moment of reckoning with our past, our present, and our future. And the central point of what I want to get to today is here and in the next slide. So for those of you who've ever listened to a college professor, what that means is pay attention for the next 2 minutes, then you can doze, and then I will come back with an emotional and stirring conclusion. After which there will be a quiz, so really try to stay sharp. So the bottom line, and I think this is in our work around our economy, in our work around climate change, in our work around brownfields, is that we need to realize that there is no going back. People often talk about how do we recover. Who would want to go to where we were before, where there was so much vulnerability by race and class and neighborhood? Who would want to simply restore our environment when there's been so much disparity? And how do we reject the idea of recovery and think about reimagination and restructuring in a way that lifts up our commonalities? How do we begin to understand that we've been in a system where people have been not just left behind, but kept behind? Not just left behind through neglect, but kept behind through redlining, through over-incarceration, through uncertain immigration status, through so many systems that have kept people on the bottom. So what does the work look like to go someplace different? I think it involves 3 things that I'll insist are important to you today. One is to recognize the depth of the crises that we're in. Second is to commit to equity, not as an afterthought, but as a guiding principle to our work. And I hope to make that very central here with the kind of work you do. And third, the idea of developing metrics that matter. Data, you'll see some graphs that help us think about accountability and impact in our work and help to ground our conversation in data. So let me start with that first big point. We are challenged with, maybe blessed with, 3 intersecting crises. The first is the climate crisis. And this is, of course, something that's threatening our planet, and it's something that's calling on us to act individually. How do we do better individually? Having driven here in my EV, I'm doing my little part. It would probably have been better if I'd come on mass transit. How do we deal with this better collectively? For example, rejecting the idea that carbon capture is actually going to be our future, instead of getting rid of the systems that produce carbon and co-pollutants at the same time, particularly in communities of color. How do we do better in terms of a green economy? So we have a climate crisis, and we need to recognize what it would mean to move in the direction of a just transition. And that just transition would center equity, but it would also center the planet. So that's our first crisis. But our second crisis is persistent and growing inequality that threatens social stability and future prosperity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's important to realize that we've got inequality that cuts across so many different dimensions. The first, this is a chart, again, that's not as crisp as it might be. It might be that the fire alarm changed the focus a little bit. But what this chart is it's showing you the income distribution, with the dark blue line being the top 1% of income receivers in the United States. And one of the things you're going to notice about this is that during most of the post-war period, between about 1945 and about 1980, the top 1% in our country got about 10% of the national income. Now they get about 22%. The 1% has run away from the rest. Another fact, which is important to realize, in the 1960s, the average CEO made about 30 times what the average worker in his, they were almost all men, firm made, about 30 times. Now the average CEO in the United States makes 350 times what the average worker in his or her firm makes. I am not sure they're 15 times more productive. But that pay gap has skyrocketed. So the 1% has run away from the rest, creates a lot of instability, creates a lot of social resentment. Beneath that, there's also been a big shift in income having to do in large part with education. And I'll talk a little bit about this and then about race. So this is the change in wage income for full-time year-round workers. So this isn't the 1%, full-time year-round workers. At the 90th percentile, meaning 10% make more, 90% make less, 80th, 20 make more, 80 make less, the middle, the bottom. One of the things that you'll notice, the gray bars are the United States, is that at the top of the wage distribution, wages in real terms have actually gone up. At the bottom, they've gone down, in the middle as well. The golden bars represent the Golden State, California. And one of the things that you're going to notice about California is we always like to overdo everything. So while income inequality has been growing in the United States in terms of this wage distribution, it's been growing on steroids in California. And if you don't like charts, that means I don't really understand you or love you. Because why you wouldn't love charts, I just don't get. But if you don't love charts, easiest way to think about this is that my dad was a janitor. If he was alive now, he would make a lot less money than he made. I'm a college professor with apparently skills. Can speak a few languages, can do statistical regressions, et cetera, et cetera. And I make a lot more money than college professors ever made. So there's been a real shift in terms of the returns to education. By the way, I say that consciously. When I get to speak, I get to make whatever point I want. So the thing I think is really important when we talk about this is to understand that these returns to education are not necessarily returns to skill. Because you walked in here today, this place is clean, someone cleaned it, they had a lot of skill. I don't know how they got paid. How many of you have kids? How many of you have young children that you drop off in childcare? Do you like to think those people have no skills? They're paid like they have no skills, right? Or if you have elders who are being taken care of. So we really need to think about these returns to education versus returns to skill. The other thing we need to think about is racial inequality as well. This is a chart, shows you the median household income by race and ethnicity in LA County. And one of the things you're going to notice is that in LA County, household income for white households, it's about $82,000. For Black, Latino households, about $45,000, $52,000. For Asian American households, about $74,000. So that's income inequality. But what I want you to take a look at is the following thing. I'm going to show you the same chart. Same scale. Except this time, we're going to look at just households with children. Look at the difference. Let me go backwards and do that again, because I really like the noise you made. It was really exciting. So yeah. So what you can tell here is that if you concentrate on how kids are being raised, white households, average median household income, $123,000. Black and Latino households, about $50,000. Asian households doing better at about $100,000. What does that mean? That means that we're baking inequality in to the future. So we've got a problem of income inequality, and we're baking it in. And by the way, these racial differences are not explained purely by differences in education. Even when you control for each and every level of education, you find differences in pay. So that's our second crisis. First crisis is the climate crisis. Second crisis is our crisis of inequality. And our third crisis, and it's one that there's House hearings on right now, is the crisis of multiracial democracy. Because what's happened is that as our country is moving to becoming majority people of color, which will happen for the United States as a whole in 2043, that for some of us, particularly those of us from California where this happened in 1998, something I'll get to in a minute, for some of us in California, all I can think about with the country becoming majority people of color is, God, everyone will know what a Korean taco truck is. What an opportunity. But for others, what's going on is that the fear of an America changing on them, of their America slipping away, is causing paranoia. It's causing an attempt to grasp onto power. And what it really calls for is new leadership. I actually remember the day that California became majority people of color. It actually probably wasn't the real day, but it was a day that a demographer said that we were becoming majority people of color. You know how they do that? They go, today is the day the 300 millionth baby was born. His name is Jose. He lives in Carson. You're like, how did you know that, right? So that day in California, I kept getting calls from reporters all day long saying we're becoming, this was the term they used, majority, minority, majority, minority, majority, minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? Tone of anxiety in their voice. And so finally, like any honest academic, I said, I don't know. But we're having a salsa party tonight at my house to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's welcome. They just need to learn a new step. How many of you have been salsa dancing and took that class before so you don't embarrass the crap out of yourself? And that's what we're doing, is we're learning a new step. For many of you who've been in this particular industry for years, the idea that communities now are empowered enough to want to speak for themselves, that they are insisting that their concerns be addressed first before you do what you want to do, that promising them jobs is not good enough if there isn't also environmental cleanup along the way. It's all of us learning a new step in what it means to live in a multiracial democracy. And it is so important that we get this right in California, because We are America fast forward. The demographic change that occurred here between 1980 and 2000 is the demographic change occurring in the United States between 2000 and 2050. We are moving forward on dealing with climate. We need to get this right. So what is behind all of these different crises, in my view, is a failure to recognize the commons and what we have in common as a people, to recognize the commons of the environment, to recognize that you cannot have this level of income inequality and social separation, to recognize that we are moving to a future together in a democratic system. So, some of you, after thinking about these big crises, might despair and say, but Manuel, what's the way out? And of course, it's my new book. Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter. Now, a couple things. If you've ever written a book, and I hope some of you get a chance to, one of the most wonderful things is the day that you get the book and you're able to hold it in your hands and look at that beautiful cover and just feel really excited. And then the frustrating thing about finally getting the book is realizing you could have said the whole thing in 3 sentences. So let me save you a little time, which doesn't mean you shouldn't buy the book. It's got a whole lot of other really good sentences. But the first sentence in our book, Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter, is that we should always talk about our economy and not the economy. When you talk about the economy, it makes it sound like a set of rules given by God or nature or the market that are out there that we have no control over. When you say our economy, it actually makes you understand that we're all in it together. And it makes you understand that we design the rules together. Think about this. Think about the following. By the way, if you know about the research on the minimum wage, one thing you'll know is that the research on the minimum wage, which David Card, famous economist, just got a Nobel Prize for, has been suggesting for about the last 20, 25 years that when you raise the minimum wage, you don't actually cost jobs. That's like kind of the first thing people teach you in an economics course, and there's almost no evidence for it at all. So much for economics, my profession. But think about this. You hear people say raising the minimum wage is bad for the economy. Think about how it sounds if you say raising the minimum wage is bad for our economy. That doesn't make any sense, because if we have minimum wage workers and they are us, it would be good for them. We have to figure out what we can do to make it possible. So always talk about our economy and always talk about our environment. It makes it much more the commons. Second thing is we need to recognize that making equity arguments is not just about fairness and inclusion and good liberal values. Research is showing that metropolitan regions and countries that are more equitable, less racially divided, less politically fragmented, actually are able to sustain growth better over time. A little bit of that comes from our own work, but it also comes from organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve, not usually known for their left-leaning political perspectives. So we often argue about equity as a fairness issue, but it's actually also a prosperity issue. And it's actually also an environmental issue. Now, what do I mean by that? I like to think of myself as a generous academic who always applauds other academics' success. And so I'm very rarely jealous. But some friends of mine put out an article with the world's best title, and so I got jealous. And the title was, Is Environmental Justice Good for White Folks? And here's what they did. They looked at metropolitan regions around the United States, and what they found out is that when there's more disparity, there's just more pollution, and it hurts white people as well. Because when there's more disparity, people think that the problem is in someone else's backyard, and then they just allow more of it to take place. And we wrote an article about the haves and have-nots and environmental inequality, and it works out around climate too. When people think the climate crisis is just going to affect some group that's not them, they wind up caring less about climate. And believe it or not, it happened during the COVID crisis as well. There's new research out showing that when the evidence came out about big disparities in terms of race, white people cared less about COVID. What we need to do, and then by the way, if you care less about COVID, you're more likely to get sick yourself, right? So what we really need to do is to understand that equity is not a special interest thing, it is the interest. That if we center equity, we will improve the environment, we will create an economy that functions better, etc. Third main point in the book is that some people do benefit from this current state of affairs, and so because of that, we need to think about social movements and community organizing. Key point for the work that all of you do is that if you care about equity, equity often comes to the table kicking and screaming and protesting, not showing up very politely. Because it's been so far removed from the table in the past that when people come, they've got frustrations, they've got anger, they've got stories to tell. So if you expect it to be without conflict, that's probably not what's going to happen. Last thing is it's key to establish data baselines and measure equity goals, outcomes, and markers. There's a big debate going on right now about the climate environmental climate and economic justice screening tool that's been developed by the White House. We have been working on equity indicators for a long time, helped to do the beta version of CalEnviroscreen, have something called the Bay Area Equity Atlas. We think measuring data is important so we can ground these equity conversations, not just in their moral values, but in their measurable data outcomes. So let me conclude with, unsurprisingly, 3 points, which is a little bit like the 3 crises, a little bit like the 3 lessons from solidarity economics. 3 final points. Why? I'm a lapsed Catholic. Everything comes in a Trinity. So, first main point is that we need to recognize the realities of our contemporary economy as we design forward. And I think that has one aspect that I frequently talk about and then one that I think is very relevant to you. People often try to talk about the California economy, our California economy of the future, and they talk about the driving sectors. You know what they are: high tech, biotech, advanced manufacturing, etc. But what they forget is that behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and food service workers and gardeners. And that our highly paid sectors are often coupled with low paid sectors that we need to do something about to lift up their pay, because they're actually part of our modern thriving economy. Fun factoid for you. What county in California has the highest share of people who are undocumented immigrants? No, it used to be Los Angeles. Good guess.
San Diego.
San Diego? Fresno. Santa Clara County. Silicon Valley. Like, they ain't mowing their lawns, right? Right? So when we think about this, we've got to be realizing that reality. But the other part of that reality is that the development work you do actually does cause displacement. So we understand that when we improve an area, we're which is really important, that runs the possibility of displacement. So how do we put in anti-displacement from the beginning so that people who live in the area can benefit, or that people who've been left behind and kept behind can be part of the development? Second big point, which is, I hope you can take it away from today, we need to, as I said before, make equity a forethought, not an afterthought. We need to make sure that equity is baked in, not sprinkled on. That we don't come up with an economic strategy or an environmental improvement strategy and say, okay, now how do we make it fair? If we start with the people who are suffering the most, the people who have been left behind, we can design something that will work for nearly all of us. So bake equity in, don't sprinkle it on. Final, last point, which is so important it seems to be slipping off the page. Final last point, I will say, is that we need to understand that we really are in a transformational moment of these three intersecting crises. And Martin Luther King is famous for a quote, which actually he borrowed from someone else. And the quote is that the arc of history is long. But you know the rest of the quote? But it bends toward justice, right? Here's the part that we always need to keep in mind. Someone has to do the bending. It doesn't bend there on its own. And we are called to act for justice. We're called to act for justice in terms of our economy. We're called to act for justice in terms of our environment. And we are called to deal with this crisis of polarization and division that means that we may never get to the beloved land unless we actually stop this process in which so many people have been othered, have been separated, have been viewed as having different fates. Thank you for your time and your attention, and we made it through without a fire alarm.
We actually have a few minutes to field some questions. So I'd like to invite anyone who would like to ask a question to come up to the mic in the center of the room. And to kick things off, Dr. Pastor, I would like to ask you, for many of the people in this room who are working in and with communities, what is the one thing we can do to take affirmative action in our community to help us begin this process?
Well, I know some of you, so I know that you're already doing it. I think it's listen. Listen to what communities are saying. Enter with your skills and humility. I think that building partnerships that last over time is absolutely critical. And, kind of build them in unusual places. I ran once for the city, helped run for the city of Pasadena, a revision of its general plan. And what they decided to do was to put most of their money into community outreach because they realized that they had a lot of political conflicts over their general plan. It's a long story. They actually got sued, so it's a long story. So we ran a process that took their minority or person of color participation from about 10% at the beginning to about 40% at the end. Still short, because the city at the time was about 52% people of color, but that's a pretty big jump over about 6 to 9 months. So how did we do it? Part of it was when they wanted to do community planning with big meetings, and we said, well, how about if we do community planning with neighborhood level meetings, and we're going to do them all in the poorest neighborhoods, so if you're affluent, you actually have to come to one of those neighborhoods to be part of the meeting. We then created what we called planning in a box, like a little kit you could take to your community. And then I and others personally went and did planning meetings in English as a second language classes to reach out to the immigrant community. People said, well, why would you go to ESL classes? I said, well, planning is a second language too. No one understands that. So we went ahead, and we actually also went to childcare centers to get the voices of those folks and get them interested in the planning. And then when we did a conference at the end, it was all designed around what we had heard from people who usually don't come. So lots of folks of color, renters, people who had not been disengaged. We didn't have a lot of stuff in historic preservation because that was not their role. So I think listening, gauging that audience, and building trust, which I know a lot of you do.
Thank you so much. Those are amazing tips, and I love that they're actionable. Some of those ideas. I'm Kate. I hope you were taking notes because we're going to use. Thank you so much for that. Where are some other questions? Anyone else have questions for Dr. Pastor? Where can we get a copy of your book?
Well, there is a website called solidarity-economics.org, and you can download the book for free. You can actually also go from that website to buy it. But in solidarity with our readers, there's a free version. There's a comic book version that you can use in the kind of community meetings we were talking about. There are videos and articles, and we have people who are willing to go out and work with folks. So we change our narrative. If you take away from today that you never say the economy again and you say our economy, that you stop talking about fairness just as a justice issue and talk about it as a prosperity issue to make sure that we're investing in the communities that have the most room to grow and prosper. And if you understand that this will be a journey that's filled with a little bit of conflict, if you take those things away, you probably won't need the quiz I was promising. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.